I'm looking forward to today's session, and I'm really grateful that Dr. Kirsty Reynolds is able to be with us today. So, Kirsty, I know you as an executive coach, and I know you're going to do an introduction in a moment. But I was really keen for you to share the outputs of your research with our community. Just before you introduce yourself or say anything about the session, I suppose, what would you like to say to the group as they arrive for this session?
Oh, just it's amazing to be here in this community and have the chance to share some of this. What I will kind of build on when I'm talking to you is that my research has findings for lots of different pots, but so it's perfect. This is a bit of a melting pot in terms of who is part of the group. So yeah, great to meet you all.
Thanks, Kirsty. And I'm really keen to hear about your research and to understand what are the implications for coaches in practice. And I'm aware that in our community we're going to have some internal coaches as well as some independent executive coaches as well. Um, so I suppose that's the lead in, if that's okay.
Okay.
And I'll
Yeah,
pass it to
brilliant.
you to
Thanks,
respond.
Damien. That's great. Okay, so as Damien said, I'm Dr. Kirsty Reynolds. So 2-minute potted bio. I was in banking for my kind of first career for nearly 10 years. And then I've been coaching for nearly 10 years now too. Both executive coaching and then also parental transition coaching. So I have a couple of different hats. I work with the wonderful team at the Tall Wall. Um, and I also do the same work through my own business and research hub, which is Soaring Birds. And then I'm also a researcher as well. I finished my doctorate a couple of years ago, but I carry out research projects still, often in-house for different organizations. And I'll share a little bit more about that as I go through. So when I was thinking about this group and sort of what would be most useful for this audience, given it is quite a mixed audience, and sharing some insights from my research, I thought I'd start with just giving a little bit of context about it. So my first career, as I said, it was in banking. It was actually specifically on the trading floor, in high yield bond and leverage loan sales, if that means anything to any of you. And when I had my first son, I sidestepped this role. I won't go into the whys of that now, but I moved into coaching, and originally it was just within financial services, and then soon after, sort of other similarly demanding professional environments, like professional services, like law firms, and so on. And alongside executive coaching, which is where I sort of started out, I quickly built up a practice around maternity coaching or parental transition coaching, as it's more widely known now, especially as we've got lots more dads taking leave. For those of you who don't know what this type of coaching is, it's specific coaching support that's structured around an individual taking extended parental leave, so a bit of time out of work, either as a mum most commonly, but also as dads. And the coach usually meets the coachee before they go on leave, before they're coming back to work, and then at least once as they're transitioning back in. So when I started doing this work, I could obviously see that there were some real tangible benefits to this coaching offering for the people it was sort of reaching. But I felt, and it was a bit personal experience as well, that it wasn't really serving the women I was meeting, who were all working in these, very often elite careers in these high performing, very demanding environments. Coupled with the fact that these environments are often very male dominated, with clear retention issues, candidly, around women at that maternity transition point. This is what prompted me really to embark upon the research doctorate, all this context. So the question I took into my doctorate, or the purpose of my research, was really to understand how women specifically can be better supported returning to work in high performance environments after maternity leave. And that's with all the nuances and the specific kind of cultural and structural considerations that these environments bring. Now, what I'm particularly interested in is that women return sustainably. And for me, that means two things. It means that they're not sacrificing their career or their well-being when they come back to work. So within that, sort of the key questions I really wanted to understand were, what were the real lived experiences of women taking leave? The good, the bad, and the ugly. We've got lots of data, but what's really going on underneath? And I was looking at that question through both the personal and the professional lens. And then where do they see the opportunities for change? Very often this is a group of people that things are done to from a top-down perspective, policies, interventions. They're all often very well intended, but don't always land very well in practice. And it's very rare that organisations employ a bottom-up approach. So, I was asking the women themselves, what works and what doesn't work? And when it came to my findings, I realised that the answers to these questions had implications for parental coaches, yes, but also a lot of takeaways for organisations themselves. The business and HR leaders who are really grappling with senior female retention, flexible working, maternity policies, and so on. And then also there was obviously a group of findings for academic research as well. So I'm going to start by just sharing some of the key findings about women's experiences, and a little bit of the difference of the before and after as well. So biggest concerns before maternity leave, just a few high-level statistics to get us started. When I asked these women, again, bearing in mind that I am always here talking about high-performance environments, so I was in banks, I was in law firms, I was in private equity firms carrying out this research. What were their biggest concerns? The first thing was maintaining their career trajectory, keeping their career on track, particularly if it was a promotion year, for example. Women were also really acutely aware of the culture they were in, the specifics of their organisational culture. What had others done? What was the precedent for leave? How had others managed it in practice rather than in policy? Finances were a big feature, particularly around kind of the non-discretionary parts and so on. And then finally, the smallest bubble, which is quite interesting in and of itself, was maintaining good maternal health. And that's both physical health and also mental health. And we'll build more on that later. So when they came back from maternity leave, the picture was much richer, which is perhaps unsurprising. People have gone out, they've kind of had the experience of maternity, they've been out of work, and now they're trying to come back in and sort of push those identities together a little bit. So there were some really strong themes that emerged. So the first one that you can see here on this screen is that managers matter so much. They were clearly flagged across, a variety of different type of organizations as, I'm going to put the gatekeeper to the maternity returner experience. That person who really makes or breaks it, to be honest. Even when women were highly prepared for their return, the surrounding environment had to be conducive as well, if that was really going to be successful for them. And at the heart of that experience, it sounds really simple, but it was whether managers had had the right conversations, whether they'd actually asked questions of the returner about their preferences rather than making, very often well-intended assumptions, but assumptions nonetheless. For example, a manager assuming that somebody won't want to work on a deal because it involves a lot of travel, well-intended, but actually the individual that I was speaking to really wanted to come back with a bang. They had put a lot of childcare infrastructure in place for themselves, and actually they were really gutted not to have been on that deal. So, it was a simple conversation would have brokered that. Nearly half of women actually said they had wanted a lot more contact, specifically with their manager, in having some of these key conversations. Secondly, more informal support wanted. Across organisations, there was a consistent theme of wanting more informal support and just contact with other parents who understand their world. A lot of us know about things like NCT and Bump and Baby, these groups, but actually what I learned and what I knew from personal experience as well is these people aren't always in similar roles. The demands that you might be stepping into, going back into, let's say a full-time job as a lawyer, are quite different to some other people in that world potentially. So what these women were really lacking was actually others who understood what they were stepping back into. really to have conversations around, how have other people managed things like, business development, board seats, client relationships, all those different sticking points. And particularly for those going back to male-dominated teams, they were often the first to go on leave in their specific team. So you get this trailblazer phenomenon that really shapes women's returner experiences. Nobody to ask for advice on one hand, but also a bit of a pressure to get it right for those who are following behind. And it was a pretty lonely experience. The return was harder than expected. For those who are parents, that's possibly not a surprising thing to read, but quite a lot of confidence front loaded before leave, not always there on the way back in. And again, this theme of loneliness and isolation really pervaded my research. Some women were quite afraid of coming back, actually, and they experienced quite a lot of stress, a lot of well-being impacts, particularly where they were, shoved straight in at 110% on day one. But then, other side of the coin is you also had women like the one I mentioned earlier who really wanted to insert themselves back in and found it hard because others were kind of cushioning and sort of making assumptions all over the place that was actually preventing them from being able to push forward where they wanted to. So again, it's, that reminder that it comes down to personal preference and the power of pretty simple conversations along the way to understand what those preferences really look like. And I put about the structures here because very often people, really weren't very comfortable with the structures that they were stepping back into. And that could be, from policy structures, it could be how promotion structures are working and so on. But even really simple things like having somewhere where women could go to pump milk. There were several cases of women who had to give up their breastfeeding prematurely, which was really distressing for them, simply because there wasn't a satisfactory place to do so at work. I remember one woman saying she had to take a backpack in and she was doing it in the loo and then she was trying to wash it and hide it in a cupboard. And, these things really shape people's experiences of a workplace for the long term, actually. Self and well-being, I touched on this earlier, but without exception, every single woman in my research reported a negative impact to their well-being when they came back from maternity leave. And obviously there was a big range within that. At one extreme, there were people who were suffering from postnatal depression, quite often not declaring it to their workplace, which was interesting, to sort of guilt and emotional turmoil at leaving their child, or even guilt about not being able to work to their pre-baby capacity. So even these very sort of career-focused women found themselves generally pretty exhausted and questioning the sustainability of these demanding, intense careers when they come back from maternity leave. And the last point, again, probably a bit of an obvious one for those of you who maybe operate in these worlds, but men really don't take leave, even where it's on offer. And when they do, they don't always take it seriously, and heads of teams generally don't either. And I witnessed and have heard a lot about sort of counter paternity cultures almost, where men are boasting about, I don't know, taking calls while their wife's on the labour ward and this kind of thing. It's a bit of a badge of honour. And that is still amazingly prevalent. And we all know that until men can take leave, these are going to remain women's issues, and therefore a bit taboo. So for organizations, and for those of us coaching within large organizations in particular, what's some really easy wins that they can be thinking about? I'm jumping straight here to the sort of findings and recommendation piece, where you want to do more for parents and particularly women taking leave. So firstly, seems minor, but this point is raised time and time again. Policies are never clear and sometimes they're hard to find, they're not readily available. So it is really good practice for HR teams in particular to just send across relevant policy documents proactively when they find out an individual's taking parental leave, both to the individual and I would recommend also to their manager as well. And then the real magic that so rarely happens is actually apply these policies consistently across your organization. Because, and I won't go into it now, but, even within, particularly within big organizations, I should say, every manager almost has their own little silo of how they do things and how things really work. And okay, this is the policy, but this is really how people do it here, both for the better and for the worse. Particularly around pay, pro-ratering bonuses, flexible working. These are things where policies exist, but actually are not consistently applied. Secondly, make sure the basics are right from a workplace perspective. Obvious comment maybe, but generally speaking, the workplace and just the rhythms of the working day, they weren't designed with women in mind, and definitely not with maternity in mind. Yet many women in these demanding careers, and elsewhere probably, are working right up until their due date. So simple things like a desk assessment to ensure that the day-to-day is comfortable, or adapting work from home policies for a period, little levers like that can make a really big difference. And then the other side, again, as I touched on, where women are potentially still breastfeeding or pumping milk, whether you have one maternity returner a year or 100, just having that safe space so that transition just feels easier and less daunting. And ideally not labeling these a luxury either, which I did here at one stage. Thirdly, if you really want to start to shift culture in organizations, it needs to not be a taboo topic. Parenting, parental leave, maternity leave. So encouraging vocal people within the organization, leaders, senior managers, to share authentic experiences around parenthood, just to help break down some of the barriers. And that includes men. It doesn't have to be just women who have taken leave, but encouraging that openness and just setting a tone for a culture where learning from lived experiences is valued. And because I think often in environments where they're trying to create an equitable environment and it's working, it's where storytelling is used. And we all know that it is such a powerful tool for shaping mindsets, for challenging assumptions, rather than just advertising your policies. And then finally, a simple logistical win, but setting up a three-way meeting when somebody's coming back from extended leave with the returner, HR, and the manager, to really understand the individual's preferences, how they want to work, what they want to work on, and then see what's achievable. Now, there's lots that lies in between that list I just showed you and this list here. But these are some of the bolder recommendations. The point on marginal flexibility. Now, most professionals returning to the high performance environments they've sort of grown up in aren't looking for a fully flexible or fully agile work arrangement. They know how these cultures work, how these systems work. But what happens in practice is a phenomena that Airy coined marginal flexibility. And that's really that ability to leave early on certain days, or come in later around childcare, go to school plays, or generally adapt the status quo of the working rhythms within the organisation. But the problem is, of course, that it is mainly women who ask for this type of flexibility. And there is a significant cost to progression. So working with organizations to really think about this concept of marginal flexibility, people living their lives on the edges and adapting their working day, but for everybody, not just for parents and certainly not just for mothers. It just begins to change the idea that parents and women need special concessions if they're going to succeed. The point around success metrics, it's a tricky one, but fundamentally there is a bias in performance management generally that prioritizes measuring the hard stuff, which is really easy to measure, rather than the soft stuff, which can't be measured. And this is really one of the biggest challenges for people who take, a chunk of time out of work. What I talk about in my book is the success equation of these careers, relationships plus numbers plus visibility. This will continue to systematically disadvantage those who take parental leave unless it's intentionally managed. I live in the real world. I work in the real world, and I know that parameters like profit, chargeable hours, etc. They have to be there. They have to win. But the question for me then becomes, what interventions are required to sustain and support those parts specifically of the success equation that get so impacted by leave. Targets, very briefly, they do not guarantee change, of course, but what they do is fundamentally alter the conditions under which change becomes possible. because without them, things like whether it's gender equity or even, more broadly things around diversity, it remains quite abstract, just a sort of cultural intention or a bit of a moral hope. But it makes it more of a strategic priority, and it targets really just give a bit of shape to those intentions. And certainly there is now an increasing amount of evidence coming out to show that targets are actually working in terms of holding people accountable, forcing organizations to track and measure and report. And finally, linking back to that last point that women in my research highlighted about it still really being a women's issue, in order to achieve equity in organizations where they are prioritizing high performance, where it is very demanding, men also need to be encouraged to take time out of the office for parental leave. It really is that simple. This is partly achieved through policy change, but this is happening more and more. And actually, if you look under some of the hood of some of these organizations, they have some of the best parental leave offerings out there in terms of time out. But what it doesn't always include is that equal level of pay during leave. And even when it does, to be honest, there is then a cultural barrier. There's different taboos in place for men taking that time out. And this is actually not just in high performing organizations. You may be familiar with grassroots movements like they call Parenting Out Loud, and there's Pregnant and Screwed, others that are campaigning to really improve that paid component of parental leaves for fathers at a national level. So just moving briefly into how I take this into my work, a 2-second shameless plug for my book, published in the new year. I haven't even finalized my cover design yet. As you can see, I'm still going back and forth with the publisher on that, but please watch this space. This is a book for business and HR leaders and really anyone with an interest in transforming the experience of parents within organizations, or even parents themselves who want to give their organizations the right idea. And then in terms of, the work that comes out of this, and I'm happy to answer any more questions on this, obviously there's parental coaching, and I think of this more as executive coaching for professionals at that point of transition rather than, a separate thing, elevating that impact further up the system as well by always working with the manager. At the in-house research consultancy, this is just, as I said, organizations often have lots of data, but this is where you go and you interview, speak to different people and really understand what's going on underneath all of that data, and coming back with themes and sharing recommendations back up to the organization. And the benefit of this for organizations, of course, is that they understand the problem specifically that they're facing in their organization, and they can adapt and sort of target their interventions. I also run leadership workshops, that's with business and HR heads, really just helping to understand, what's going on, what's already happening within your organization, and how can you start to redesign how some of these things are viewed and think about accountability as part of it. And then finally, I've got the privilege of bringing a lot of this work into offsites, to women's and parents networks, client dinners and so on, because the heart of all of this really is what matters to me most is giving voice to the women behind this research, supporting the parents that I'm coaching every day, and ultimately just trying to help reshape the workplace, even if it is just conversation by conversation and system by system. And hopefully it will contribute for parents and women for good longer term. Conscious of time, I'm going to pause now and ask if there's any questions.
Yeah, Kirsty, I'll have a quick read of some questions that are just coming through.
Oh, thank you. Yes. Yeah, I can't see that as well as my screen, actually.
I just wanted to ask, so just from your experience, because there are some assumptions I can make as a coach in terms of where coaching really makes a difference. But I suppose just from your experience, what impacts have you seen when parents and women who are returning from maternity leave are given coaches? What have you seen the difference that happens?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, the obvious nuclear thing is actually they come back to work when maybe they might not have done. That's the sort of extreme situation. But actually, for me, it's more about that point around sustainability again. It's sort of coming back and having designed for yourself and with your manager and with the system you're in a way that you can come back and really have your career, but without slowly eroding, your well-being on the other side.
Mm. And Emma has just, I'm just going to read out her reflection. I'd be very
Mm.
grateful if you, if it would be possible to expand on the emotional difficulties and loss of trust that can cause a mother if they end breastfeeding prematurely because of a lack of workplace facilities. So Emma previously reflected that it was really helpful for you to share some of the experiences um, for someone who hasn't experienced parenthood. Um, so yeah, just
Yeah.
anything else you'd add to that, Kirsty?
So sorry, just to clarify, it's asking kind of what the emotional impact
Yeah,
was.
just expand on the emotional difficulties and loss of trust that you may have seen, especially in that context where, someone's had to end breastfeeding prematurely. But just
Yeah, I think it's really difficult because I think there's lots of pressures on women, in the Western world, I'm going to say, to breastfeed for a year. There's, because that's what the NHS guidelines are, and I know in the US there's, because people typically go to back to work earlier, there's a big culture of pumping milk there as well. But I think what women found hard was even where they felt they had provisioned on a personal level for this, I don't know, blocking time in their diary, for example, it wasn't respected. It wasn't a boundary that they were able to hold or felt comfortable defending. So they were into this place where they were having to reveal more than they wanted to about what was going on for them,
Mm.
if indeed they were going to be able to achieve what they wanted professionally. So yeah, perhaps a roundabout way of answering your question,
Yeah,
but
no.
definitely
Well,
it was emotionally
mm,
very, very distressing for some people when their milk had dried up because they hadn't been able to pump when they wanted to, for example.
yeah, yeah. So I'm just going to pick up on another question from Rosie, which is, how can coaches develop themselves to support parental transition coaching?
Yeah, and I think this is really environment specific, but I think if you're stepping into these types of, demanding organizations, and I'm trying to condense sort of 10,000 words of doctorate here into 30 seconds, but coach the exec in front of you would be my biggest advice. Hold the time and space where you meet them quite lightly, just because they're going on leave or just because they're just back from leave. Don't you walk into that room expecting to make that the big event. They may well want to talk about, childcare, the challenges with milk, work-life balance, and so on, but they might actually want to talk about their career, their business development pipeline, and so on. They're managing a business relationship. So yeah, just not trying to teach you to suck eggs, but some parental coaching has definitely slipped into being quite directive and quite predictable, a bit more like training, covering off topics.
Mm-mm.
But I think with high performers, just think of this as executive coaching and coach the whole person and chuck out the maternity coaching playbook a bit.
Mm. Thank you. Thank you. And we're getting some more questions coming. I'm conscious of time. I'm just going to go
Yeah, I was going
read
to
one.
say, I know time could be tight for some
Yeah.
people. I'm on LinkedIn and I'm
Right.
really, really happy to take further questions and speak to anybody who's interested in this at another point if you need to wrap up.
Yeah, which is perhaps final question from Lisa. Perhaps we'll end with this one, if that's okay. If you've got time, Kirsty.
Yeah, yeah, no, I'm
Do you,
fine. Yeah.
do you see any common overcorrections in high achievers returning to work after leave?
Yes. Yes, massively. Overcorrections, yeah, in terms of just trying to be all things to all men, if you pardon the expression, but certainly trying to over deliver on the work front, very often over delivering on the home front. And one key thing I always set up with women before they're coming back is what's your minimum standard for this working month? The things you want to achieve in this month, and what's your minimum standard on the home front? Just trying to keep them focused on the bottom line rather than what they were doing up here at the top line, because there is a huge amount of overcorrection, overcompensation, even from as early as pregnancy, actually.
Yeah, wonderful. And as we continue, Kirsty, we can see why having a coach is so, so important. And I was also reflecting, the bringing women together in a group or men in groups as well for group coaching around these
Yeah,
themes
yeah,
as well.
exactly. Yeah.
Mm. So they can contact you on LinkedIn,
Yes.
and your book is being published in the new year, which I'm sure
Yeah.
we'll post out on our community as well.
Brilliant. Yeah.
I just want to say, really appreciate you sharing your high level research, the outcomes. It's been really thought provoking for me, actually. So I've really appreciated your input, Kirsty.
Brilliant. Thank you. And thanks everyone for the questions. As I said, very happy to pick any of these up at a later stage.
Wonderful. Perhaps we'll do a part two.
Yeah. All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye.